47 years ago, a young woman was murdered right inside her own apartment in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, leaving behind her newlywed husband and a community living in fear. Authorities interviewed 300 people, formed a task force, consulted criminologists, but found no suspect and no leads to pursue. The investigation eventually reached a dead end. However, through all those years, the only DNA sample from the crime scene was never discarded. It was carefully stored through generations of investigators. Then, a genetic genealogist decided to try a strategy that had never been used before, tracing the family tree back 4 centuries to a small village in southern Italy. And what she found pointed directly to a man who had been living right in Lancaster County for nearly half a century in a way no one could have imagined. Before we dive deeper into this story, please let us know where you're watching from. And if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next cases. In 1975, America watched the last helicopters leave the roof of the Saigon embassy in chaos. Gerald Ford had just signed the controversial pardon for Nixon, and TVs in the living rooms of millions of American families were showing scenes of Saigon's people desperately climbing the embassy walls. It was a year when America was weary, skeptical, and unsure what to believe next. In Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, 2 hours drive west of Philadelphia, the Amish tobacco and cornfields stretched right next to apartment complexes. Lindy Sue Beekler, 19 years old, worked as a floral shop employee in Lancaster County. Long hair, gentle smile. That was how people who knew her described her later. She was married to Philip Beekler. The young couple lived in the Spring Manor apartment complex on Kloss Drive in Manor Township. It was the life Lindy and Phil were building together. Not glamorous, no big ambitions, just 2 young people starting their life together in a small apartment. On the afternoon of December 5, 1975, before going grocery shopping, Lindy stopped by the bank to deposit the couple's paycheck. Lindy returned to the Spring Manor apartment with grocery bags in her hands, placed them on the dining table, and hadn't opened them yet. Between 6:45 p.m. and 9 p.m., in the living room of that apartment, Lindy Sue Beekler was attacked. She fought back. She didn't surrender. She didn't give up. She fought with everything she had. But the attacker had 2 knives, one brought from outside and one taken from her kitchen. She was stabbed 19 times in the neck, chest, abdomen, and back. When her uncle and aunt, who stopped by that evening to exchange cooking recipes, knocked on the door and entered, they discovered a scene that would never be erased from their memories for the rest of their lives. Lindy lay on her back on the living room floor. The knife was still embedded in her neck. A dish towel was wrapped around the knife handle, an intentional act to conceal fingerprints by the person who did this. Police were called immediately that night. The crime scene showed clear signs of a violent struggle and a sexual motive. A man's footprint was found in the kitchen. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death, severe blood loss. Signs of sexual assault were confirmed. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms showed that Lindy had fought to the end. She wasn't killed quickly, wasn't attacked without a chance to react. This was a real struggle in the living room of that small apartment. She did not surrender. Investigators noted an important detail about the timing. The attack occurred in a very narrow window between when Lindy got home and when Phil was expected to return, suggesting the killer was not a random passerby, but someone who knew her schedule, knew she would be home alone at that time, and knew she would be by herself. Manor Township and Lancaster County Police began interviewing acquaintances, neighbors in the 4-unit building, and co-workers at the floral shop. They formed a task force. They consulted criminologists from outside agencies. Phil Beekler was questioned as standard procedure in every case involving a married victim and was cleared. There was no evidence pointing convincingly to anyone in Lindy's circle of acquaintances. The killer left no identifiable fingerprints. The man's footprint in the kitchen led nowhere. And the dish towel wrapped around the knife handle, an intentional act by someone calm enough to think about concealing fingerprints even while committing the murder, showed this was not someone out of control, but someone still rational enough to protect himself even while killing. DNA was collected from semen on Lindy's underwear, the only piece of evidence from the entire crime scene that came directly from the killer. In 1975, there was no technology to do anything with this sample except store it and wait. Investigators documented it, packaged it carefully, labeled it, and filed it away. They knew it was the most important thing in the entire case. They just didn't know they would have to wait nearly half a century for that most important thing to reveal a name. In the months and years after the murder, Lancaster County investigators interviewed a total of 300 people, a number that reflected the scale of desperation, that reflected an investigation following every possible lead, every acquaintance of Lindy's, every regular customer at the floral shop, every resident of the Spring Manor complex and nearby apartments. They consulted criminologists from agencies outside Lancaster County. They revisited the crime scene multiple times. They followed every small lead until it hit a dead end, then went back to find another. But no lead went anywhere. No name emerged from those 300 interviews as someone to focus on. No evidence pointed convincingly to any specific individual. No tips from the community pointed in a direction worth pursuing. The killer left no identifiable trace except the DNA sample. And in 1975, that DNA sample was just a packaged item filed away, with no practical investigative value at the time. Then the 1990s arrived, bringing what Lancaster County investigators had been waiting for since the night of December 5, 1975. DNA testing began to be integrated into the American justice system. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the semen DNA sample in the case file could be used as a real investigative tool. They submitted the sample to CODIS, the national DNA database that compiles DNA from people who have been arrested and convicted across America. The result came back: no matches. The killer had no criminal record, no police file, no reason for his DNA to be in any database. In 2019, the newly established cold case unit in the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office decided to try a different approach. They asked Parabon Nanolabs to use the crime scene DNA to create a composite image, the predicted face of the suspect at age 25 when the crime occurred, reconstructed from the genetic information in that DNA sample. In September 2019, 2 images were released publicly, along with a call for information from the Lancaster County community. The press covered it. People watched. And then nothing. No significant tips came in. No names were suggested that led anywhere. The case remained ice cold. The years passed. Lancaster County changed. New neighborhoods sprang up on old fields. New generations grew up who didn't know the name Lindy Sue Beisler. And the Spring Manor apartment complex on Kloss Drive continued to exist. Phil Beisler was a 20-year-old man who lost his wife in the first year of their marriage, not to illness, not to an accident, but in a way no ordinary words and language could describe. And he grew older each year with a question that had no answer. The case file remained open on paper, the oldest unsolved cold case in the entire history of the county, a title no one wanted. The DNA sample remained in the lab, preserved through generations of investigators, each one receiving the file from the previous and setting it down with the same helplessness. 47 years, long enough for a child born after Lindy's death to grow up, become an adult, and have their own children. 47 years, and the killer was still living in the same Lancaster County, still going about his normal life, still aging. In April 2018, all of America paid attention to a shocking arrest in California. Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer who had killed at least 13 people and sexually assaulted more than 50 victims throughout the 1970s and 1980s, was arrested after more than 40 years on the run thanks to an entirely new investigative technique called genetic genealogy. This technique didn't search for the suspect's DNA in criminal databases, but searched for his relative's DNA in public genealogy databases, and then built family trees to narrow it down to the individual. The Lancaster County Cold Case Unit followed the Golden State Killer case with special interest, and in 2020, they reached out to Cece Moore, the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, who had helped solve hundreds of cold cases across America. Moore looked at the file and immediately recognized this was a different case from anything she had ever worked on. In most genetic genealogy cases, investigators find DNA matches at the level of distant relatives, cousins, uncles, people sharing common ancestors 2 or 3 generations back, then build family trees to narrow it down to a specific individual. But in the Lindy Sue Beisler case, the closest matches in the entire public genealogy database were extremely distant relatives, people sharing common ancestors with the killer from the 17th or 18th century, 300 to 400 years ago. Conventional methods could not be applied. Moore had to develop an entirely new strategy, tracing the family tree not through decades, but through centuries. A task she described as the hardest in her career. After many months of work, Moore and her colleagues identified the single common point among all the DNA matches in the database: their ancestors, whether they lived in Pennsylvania or any other U.S. state, all originated from the same place, Gasparina, a small village in Calabria, southern Italy. From a lab in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, in 2020, the investigation traced back to a village in southern Italy from the 17th century. Then followed forward again through generations of migration and settlement to find which family from Gasparina had come to Lancaster County and left descendants still living there today. Moore cross-referenced that information with the genealogy records of Lancaster County families with Gasparina roots, a small, specific group with few qualifying individuals. Then she narrowed it further by age and gender, gradually eliminating names that didn't fit. The list shrank to very few, and one of the remaining names was David Sinopoli. David Sinopoli, 68 years old, living in East Hempfield Township, Lancaster County, not far from where Lindy Sue Bieshler was killed, a man who had lived in the same county for the past 47 years. No criminal record, no police file. No sign in nearly half a century that would make any investigator or neighbor connect him to the Spring Manor apartment and the 19-year-old woman murdered inside it. Investigators confirmed one more detail. In 1975, Sinopoli had lived in that exact 4-unit building at Spring Manor, the same building as Lindy and Phil Bieshler, just a few steps away from the victim. A neighbor whose face and name Lindy might have known, someone she might have nodded to when passing in the hallway. Not a single tip in 47 years. Not once had his name appeared in any investigation file. When Sinopoli's name appeared on C.C. Moore's list, Lancaster County investigators did not approach him immediately because direct contact would expose the investigation, give him time to prepare, and lose the only element of surprise they had. Instead, they began surveillance, quietly, patiently, without revealing anything to anyone. They needed his DNA to confirm Moore's findings, but they didn't have enough evidence for a court order to compel a sample, and a direct request would blow everything. They waited. They tracked Sinopoli's daily routine, noted the places he went, and waited for the moment he left behind DNA on a discarded item. Voluntary DNA, the kind of evidence courts would accept. On February 11, 2022, David Sinopoli went to Philadelphia International Airport. He drank coffee. He threw the cup in the trash. Investigators were there, waiting for that exact moment. They retrieved the cup from the trash and sent it to the lab. The DNA test results came back. The DNA sample from the coffee cup that David Sinopoli threw in the trash at Philadelphia Airport matched exactly with the semen DNA collected from Lindy Sue Bieshler's underwear. Match probability, approximately 1 in 10 trillion. The result was further confirmed by bloodstains on the same clothing of Lindy's. There was no room left for any doubt. The coffee cup thrown in the trash at Philadelphia Airport had ended the 47 years that David Sinopoli probably thought he would carry with him to his grave. On July 17, 2022, Lancaster County investigators went to David Sinopoli's home in East Hempfield Township and arrested him 46 years, 7 months, and 12 days after Lindy Sue Bieshler was murdered. The next day, District Attorney Heather Adams stood in front of the press at the Lancaster County Courthouse and announced the oldest cold case in Lancaster County history had been solved. The shock to the Lancaster County community did not come from the suspect being a celebrity or someone of special social status. It came from something else, something heavier and harder to digest. The realization that for 47 years, no one, no lead, no anonymous tip, no investigator over decades had ever looked in David Sinopoli's direction. He had been living right in the same Lancaster County all those years, within reach of everyone, aging year by year. Adams said in the press conference, "This case was solved thanks to advances in DNA technology. To be honest, without that, I don't know if we would have ever solved it." Phil Bieshler, the man who left home on the morning of December 5, 1975 as a young husband and returned that night to a completely different life, who had lived another 47 years with a question that had no answer, heard the news of the arrest after nearly half a century. For the first time since that night, the name of the man who killed his wife had a face, an address, and he had been caught. After his arrest in July 2022, Sinopoli was held in jail awaiting trial for more than a year, long enough for him to sit with what he had done and decide not to fight in court. There was no full trial, no jury, no long days with witnesses and opposing arguments. On October 19, 2023, David Sinopoli, 69 years old, walked into the Lancaster County courtroom before Judge David Ashworth and pleaded guilty to 3 charges: third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. In the courtroom that day, Assistant District Attorney Christine Wilson placed a photo of Lindy Sue Bieshler right next to the defendant's seat, so David Sinopoli had to sit beside the face of the woman he had killed nearly half a century earlier. Wilson turned to Sinopoli, pointed directly at the photo, and said, "These cases are never forgotten. Lindy Sue will never be forgotten." While the defendant was able to continue living his life, Lindy was cut short by him. "Look at her and the precious life you stole in 1975. Sinopoli glanced at the photo. There was no reaction on his face, no remorse, no emotion, not a single facial muscle changed in the way people expect when looking at the face of the person they killed. Judge Ashworth said, "The level of harm you caused is incomprehensible. The depravity of your actions cannot be overstated." The judge also noted that the defendant only pleaded guilty because he was caught, not because of remorse, not because of conscience, not for any other reason. Phil Bieshler stood up in the courtroom, the man who lost his wife at age 20, and spoke directly to Sinopoli's face. "You took a huge part of my life and caused immeasurable suffering to so many people. While others have had to live with the terrible consequences of the murder you committed, you got to live your life." When given the opportunity to speak by Judge Ashworth, Sinopoli said just one sentence: "I want to apologize to everyone, including my wife." No explanation for why he entered that apartment, no reason for the 19 stab wounds, not a single word about the night of December 5, 1975. The only question that Phil Bieshler, Lindy's family, and everyone in the courtroom really wanted to know, why, still had no answer, and probably never would. Judge David Ashworth sentenced him, according to the plea agreement, 25 to 50 years in prison, the maximum that could be applied for each individual charge under Pennsylvania criminal law in 1975. Meaning Sinopoli received the sentencing framework from the era he committed the crime, not the era he was caught. Sinopoli was also ordered to pay $25,210 in prosecution costs. At age 69, a 25 to 50-year sentence was effectively a life sentence. David Sinopoli would never walk out of prison gates for the rest of his life, and he would die behind bars while Phil Bieshler and Lindy's family continued living with what they had lost, with nothing to make up for it. District Attorney Heather Adams stood before the press after the sentencing and stated, "Thanks to the dedication of many law enforcement officers from multiple agencies over many years, justice has finally been served for Lindy Sue Bieshler. The DNA evidence analyzed by Parabon precisely identified Lindy's killer, and the sentence the court issued today will be a well-deserved life sentence for this 69-year-old defendant." Assistant District Attorney Wilson added, "The defendant thought he had gotten away with it while he continued his life for 48 years. But the never forgetting of Lindy Sue Bieshler, the persistent work of many people over many years, and advances in DNA and technology finally caught up with him. The Lindy Sue Bieshler case did not create a law named after her, did not lead to a non-profit organization or a TV program named after her. But in the community of people who work on cold cases using genetic genealogy, this case holds a special place that no other case has, because it was the hardest among the cases solved this way. And that very difficulty forced those doing the work to come up with a new way to do their job. C.C. Moore had to develop a method that had never existed before to trace the family tree back 4 centuries, from a lab in Lancaster County to a small village in southern Italy from the 17th century. Then follow it forward through generations of migration and settlement to find one man. That method has become a tool for other cold cases that previously no one thought could be solved using genetic genealogy. That is the real legacy of the Lindy Sue Bieshler case. The Lindy Sue Bieshler case leaves behind practical lessons that every American, especially women living alone or in small apartment complexes, can apply immediately to their daily lives. First, always lock your doors. Even if you live in a quiet neighborhood, even if you know your neighbors, even if you're only gone for a few hours, In 1975, Lancaster County was a place where no one locked their doors because no one thought it was necessary, and that was exactly why the killer could walk in. Second, be careful with people who live in the same building, not because every neighbor is dangerous, but because the most dangerous person is often the one you would never suspect, the one you nod to every day without thinking twice. Third, let your loved ones know your schedule, not just saying I'm going to the store, but clearly stating the time you leave, when you'll be back, and who to call if you're not back on time. Lindy didn't have anyone who knew she would be home alone during that time window, and the killer knew that. Fourth, trust your instincts. If someone in your building makes you feel uncomfortable without a clear reason, that's not paranoia, that's your survival instinct working. And finally, this case reminds us that DNA never lies and never forgets. Even if it takes 47 years, justice still comes. Never think a case has been forgotten just because it has gone cold. If you find this video valuable, please hit subscribe and share so stories like this can continue to be told, because every share from you might be the thing that reminds someone out there about their own safety. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next video.